Hello everyone, today we introduce the War of the Third Coalition in a mini-series that I plan for this autumn. Will be probably just 4 videos, in fact, illustrating both the political but specifically the strategical and even tactical choices. There is a crescendo here, of course, culminating with Austerlitz. In fact, this one of the most, if probably the most complete chapter of Napoleonic warfare. As you know, we discussed Napoleonic warfare in some videos, but never entered in the details really. Nor in this series we will, for example, make a single video about, I don't know, probably the last one will be about Austerlitz per se, but it will not be the video that I want to make, definitely about in theory, all the Napoleonic battles that we will analyze in something much bigger and much more analytical. Again, I would like the series to literally exemplify some, say, the complexity of political and strategic and even tactical decision making, right? What really lays at the root of it, and what are the events that can influence it. And I think this has the purpose to educate on the value of the choice, not the say the value of the preconditions per se, but how much leadership can affect the world in everything, right? And how there is always an open option for anything. And this is, in fact, a strategical, just to stick to the military side of the story, but a political one, of course, measure per se. Von Clausewitz talks about this specifically by saying essentially that even military actions that do not exist and will not exist have, however, in the potential of their possibility, in fact, a strategic weight, a strategic importance. Right, and this naturally is one of the most beautiful examples of how, of course, war is dictated by moral forces, and how projections of eventual potential actions that can occur have, of course, a weight that must be considered. And much of all of this is, not really quantifiable. Right, it can be calculated, can be appreciated, will have a concrete effect, and those who develop a specific sensitivity and experience and understanding of military political matters altogether realize it, right? But only after having analyzed concretely what reality is, what politics is, what war is, not with wishful thinking. And what better examples, of course, the ones of wars that are actually led, right, and actually happen historically. And I thought of this not just because of the interesting chapter that we will be looking at in this series, but also for what I think is crucial in today's situation, really in general, but still quite concretely, regarding the essentially the disconnection, I think, of people in general, again, very, very unspecifically, towards reality altogether, right? Thinking that essentially things will go just in a direction or another, rather than looking at what can happen and how to make it happen, right? And in fact, the common rhetoric that you listen to today, mostly regarding the events that run the news, let's say, is, no, things must just go and will go this direction, and there is no way to change it, and it's doomed and whatever. This is exactly the first indicator of complete incompetence, ignorance, and fundamental incapacity of any kind, fundamentally, to address any real situation that is something that, again, is so complex, and to be addressed by people who just study these things for years and years and years of their lives from a professional point of view, that, it naturally denounces the states of affairs of our dramatic undereducation and, incompetence, and again, unreliability of the masses in general, but also shows us how, of course, the masses are always manipulated, and this is how you can fight that battle politically exactly on the stupidity of the masses, which has been basically the overwhelming majority of politics all over history, with the masses that keep babbling and repeating, either we're being exploited by someone that you don't even know who is, because of course if you don't know about the complexity of reality, you cannot even understand that. But of course, or oh my God, we escaped this dramatic danger, and the people made it. No, the people, like in the history of mankind, fundamentally in general, is that the average person basically do not do anything but being guided by others, right? If it's not one side, it's the other, and they just, from the 19th century, I guess that in part, and that's also why this series is interesting, because we witness exactly the same years of the Code Napoleon, etc., the creation of contemporary state, and so that unlocking of the masses as essentially, look, we will give you some rights because we think there is potential in you, and seeing how they wasted it completely, right? And how this objectively brought to a sort of elevation of individualistic narcissism from side of people that at the time otherwise would have not even, and still haven't understood fundamentally what they can't do with their freedom, because basically freedom is useless, just liberty is a civilizational human value, and the rest basically does not exist. But of course, screwing up completely, because we are fallen kind and nobody's perfect. But let's acknowledge that the majority is just also beyond just not perfect in this regard. Now, Austerlitz also has a major military historical, the Austerlitz campaign, we can call it the War of the Third Coalition, that had also some other sub-branches. There was the invasion of Naples. There were other, military operations we will not look at today, nor in the rest of the series. There is also Trafalgar, of course, that we will address at some point. But we will focus naturally and mostly on the terrestrial scenario, right? And we will today, at least, address mostly also this enormous background that brought. This is very fascinating in warfare to realize how some places that apparently had no meaning, but will be remembered on a map, because politics and strategy made consuming there some of the greatest clashes in the history of mankind, right? And the events of 1805 are really grandiose in bigger scale, and by the way, in an unprecedented scale in military history at that point. So the road to Austerlitz starts metaphorically, but not only, from Calais on the north coast of France. As you know, in limpid days you can't even see Britain from there. And the peace treaty stipulated in 1801 in Amiens between the United Kingdom and the French Republic had never been fully respected, of course, by the contracting parties, for obvious reasons. Too many reasons, in fact, for mutual dissatisfaction, too many profound motives that made clear beyond any possible will to reconciliation that the world, so we're not talking just about Europe at this point, of course, after the 7 Years' War, there is really a global, scale of conflictuality that starts from, the European empires spread around the earth. Was too small, in fact, to simultaneously host British power and leave room for Napoleon's enormous ambition for domination. Right? Napoleon, to counter British hegemony on the planet, had designed a strategic complex that included, it was really, as big, right? Except that the French did not have the same means of strategic projection, read the Royal Navy. And in fact, it included the control of Egypt, as you know, which was the origin of the failed expedition of 1798. We will make a video about that because that's very interesting on the truth. The alliance with the rebel colonies of the nascent United States of America, support for the most dangerous enemies of the British in India, the Maratha Confederacy, the establishment of colonies in Africa, a stronger French presence also in the West Indies. There was the failed Haiti expedition. Here there is also, there had been previously the Louisiana Purchase, quite important events in American history. Even an invasion of Australia. Now, any truce could therefore only be artificial. It was just, in fact, a situation of perennial conflictuality and quasi-war by some degree. In fact, this truce was fraught with friction, and it lasted only for 2 years until Great Britain preferred to take advantage of, in fact, the opportunities that an open war provided to her navy, right? Delivering, in fact, themselves a formal declaration of state of belligerence to France, to the French. It was May the 16th, 1803. A French convoy in the English Channel had fired broadside against a frigate of the British Navy. A month later, Napoleon played his card, then a card held up in waved in the air for a long time. In fact, the first consul announced the creation of the Armée d'Angleterre, the Army of England, the army that once and for all would have resolved the controversy with an invasion of Great Britain, and that was deployed in Boulogne, a town, as you know, close to Calais, about 50 kilometers only from the beaches of Folkestone. This was, needless to say, an ambitious, even daring plan, but that posed, in fact, enormous difficulties, but also enormous opportunities at the same time. And the cost-benefit ratio there was, as you understand, mostly in favor of the French on land, but in favor of the British at sea. And the French nation was eager to invest in it, as the country was still inflamed by the spirit of the revolution, and in any case, ready, as always, to face the traditional enemy island, who can't call it this way. And so they enthusiastically accepted Napoleon's initiative. Today we will not digress on the broader picture here. I think most of you are well acquainted with the context of the Napoleonic era in general, the Revolutionary Wars, the rise of power of Napoleon in France, and more generally, as we will also see a bit now, the one of the various other European powers. There would be a lot to tell in a broader political and historical and philosophical way regarding the French Revolution and its consequences. That there is still today an enormous divide historiographically, let's say, regarding the Napoleonic era per se. There's mostly an Anglo-Saxon current that was influenced by great thinkers such as Burke, for example, other contemporaries also of the events that stigmatized the rise of the nation state and of the contemporary state, contemporary era, this totalization and the centralization brought by the Code Napoleon. There is another philosophy, mostly one stemming already from a civil law background that had also influenced, generally speaking, the relations between certain areas of Europe and others. And so it has a lot to do not just with the times or with Napoleon himself, but with with a much greater picture, right? The Revolutionary Wars, generally speaking, triggered unleashed this enormous French potential that the Ancien regime had tried to curb. The French revolutionary armies were, against expectation, dramatically loaded and effective from a moral point of view, and also a material point of view. And there is therefore, an epos that eventually in the countries of more kind of Jacobin legacy has been, weaved around the figure of Napoleon, the Revolutionary Wars, and generally speaking also the wars of independence of many countries in Europe that followed. In fact, the restoration, so the attempt essentially by the pre-revolutionary powers to put under the carpet fundamentally the forces that had been in fact unleashed by that point. This channel is also very connected with the broader thing because that von Clausewitz essentially fought all his life against Napoleon, but he was the same proponent, and not just the same one. This was true also for von Scharnhorst and other military reformers that understood the need essentially to trigger in their own countries at the same type, or at least to follow the same path, just with their own native flavor of an inclination, propensity of the Napoleonic reforms, the creation of mass warfare, not just of mass society, mass politics in the sense, considering the ambition of these powers for literal world domination. And that fundamentally the same unification in Germany stemmed from the Clausewitzian intuitions, from what, in fact, the Prussians had learned the very hard way, especially the year after the War of the Third Coalition, in fact, at Jena Auerstedt, and the destruction essentially of Frederick II's army and thought and era, and all what at that point Prussia had fundamentally embodied. And so there is something that goes beyond the mere say, I hate Napoleon because I believe that after all he was a leftist and he was centralizing and I hate that. Well, this is not a coherent way of thinking for many reasons. First of all, because there has never really been a civilization or a great power in the world that didn't centralize, right? The same is true for Britain, the same is true for America. If you want to have a great power, you need a state, right? What you can read in a traditional universal sense is, of course, what is the state made of? And, of course, those states that are more morally loaded, of course, make things work better in perspective because they are in control, actually, of the means of centralization from a in a popular sense. So, therefore, the initial digression on the fact that people do not fundamentally know how to handle this, of course, is concrete, right? The same French Revolution eventually didn't lead at all, as you know, and the Napoleonic regime is also quite eloquent on that, on kind of the people ruling. There's never been historically, and thank God, any place, not even the most radical Periclean Athens, such a thing like the masses actually ruled, because first of all, they can't rule. Secondly, direct democracy would be literally the dictatorship of the proletariat. So we always talk of indirect democracy, which fortunately means that, yes, we entrust power to the better people, right? And when even you disagree with who rules you and governs you, just know that that is the total, complete, identical reflection of the community you live in. Right, and there is no such thing that there is a good right and a bad left, or vice versa. If this right or left are disgustingly culturally underdeveloped. In other words, you cannot complain just as a conservative of things like what the left is doing right now, without recognizing that you're part of the same culture and that there is a deep problem in your culture, and that it's not solved just by sticking from one side or the other of the aisle. It has to be solved at a human level that normally these situations do not allow, right? Because you do not allow it, and so this is also how you can read fundamentally the destruction of the Ancien Regime on the long run, which surely triggered some of the most horrifying stories in the history of mankind, because of course, again, they were the same countries and the same people. Why totalitarianism came to exist after the end of the great empires, it's not because the great empires were anything good. They were rotten from the within, and they just left space to their own rot, because they didn't have any strength anymore. So, as always in war, is why does a country win and the other doesn't? Well, there are many, say, reasons why war is, in fact, not absolute, as the Clausewitzian theory perfectly explains. And you can have small countries defeating bigger ones, but also historically not achieving much in the process. Think about Vietnam, for that matter. And so victory and defeat are actually subjective. And I made a video specifically about this. But the point being still is that if you are, irreparably defeated, it's because probably you were an inferior culture. And this is what we are not allowed to say out loud, which is actually the only fair-minded attitude there should be towards the world and reality, right? There is no particular reason why, the conquistadors wiped out the hell of Mesoamerican civilizations, because, the West was an overwhelmingly superior civilization to the one of the Americas, and that simply gave way. If they had had any consistency there to oppose to the Western achievements, they would have simply kept the Europeans out. They couldn't, right? And that is a problem, because even the possibility that you hadn't preventivated this thing does speak of your limits, and not much of else. So what happened in during Napoleonic Wars is very thought-provoking and fascinating, because it literally acquaints you to that degree of complexity that we were talking about at the beginning, and should make you read clearly what actually occurred, not using complexity as an excuse for moral relativism. And this is unfortunately instead what goes on forever now, because of the crisis of expertise and the incapacity of looking at the comprehensive picture. In fact, the same war, the Third Coalition, there is pretty dark, right? There was hardly any side there that was really fighting for a broader sense of liberty in the way we intend. Of course, they were all interested, and also in that sense, there is nothing wrong by a certain degree. But there were also quite devilish pacts that were being in fact sealed, and there was a lot of distrust among the same allies that also undermined, in fact, the same coalition at a point. And this had happened with the previous two. As we'll see now, for example, Prussia wouldn't even enter the war. The Austrians distrusted basically anyone there. The British hated the Russian guts, and vice versa. And yes, the French were really set to do something extraordinarily upsetting for all those who were to believe in that traditional order of things. And Germany and Italy were at large basically already under the French and more. But we will see it perhaps now a little bit better. In any case, we will get in depth during the course of the series. Now, so when Napoleon called for the Armée d'Angleterre, each French municipality, from the richest to the most remote, began a collection of funds through which it was possible to provide, in fact, for the construction of an immense flotilla of landing boats that the Army of England, already 150,000 men strong, would have used to cover in 10 hours, according to forecasts, the stretch of sea that separates it from its theater of operations. This was the great magic of the contemporary state. Hundreds of thousands of men capable of operating with that fluidity and strategical projection, and fundamentally just having the means to be, in fact, collectively trained, armed, equipped, and supplied by a state, right? And this is the civilizational accomplishment that, whether you like it or not, leaves in the, at least in the consequences of the French Revolution. And that is the same one on the base of which basically every first world, if not beyond, country rests today, independently from the common law or civil law tradition. We have expanded all dramatically towards that degree of statal control and centralization to afford the magnitudinally, exponentially increased military power that we can, boast today. The world ages, but the civilization is the test of your capacities to wield that immense power, erode those who use it if these are not prepared, if they're not up to the power that God has given to man, right? And remember always, we are a fallen kind, and also our destructive capacities are, according to tradition, a consequence of that. And there is, however, still always a way to say, it was the God's response to say, you wanted fire, now handle it, right? But just know what that can mean, and we've seen definitely what humanity is capable of. Now, the extraordinary contribution of the French would have also served to give new impetus to the construction of, in fact, the French so-called ships of the line, the warships, practically, which during the journey across the Channel were supposed to protect the French army from the foreseeable reaction of the Royal Navy. And that was the most important problem for the French, really. The Royal Navy would still have remained too powerful an opponent to be reached or even less exceeded on a qualitative level. We will digress at some point in another video on why the Royal Navy was the might that it really was. So the French problem was focusing, carefully in a strategic preparation necessary to catch the British Navy unprepared. Napoleon then planned a complex shift of the fleet to confuse the British ideas and to be able to evade their surveillance of the Manche. The overall size of the project was so huge, as you understand, as to make the even significant commitment made minuscule in comparison, and it was immediately clear that it would have taken many months before the invasion could take place. The members of the Army of England, which gradually grew to 200,000, spent their time in grueling maneuvers and landing training, and also found the energy to make the Boulogne camp a, quote, graceful and welcoming city of huts embellished with gardens and enriched with vegetable gardens. The senior officers seemingly encouraged the troops to devote themselves to these soothing activities. However, considering that the French army was essentially made up of peasants, these would have not needed too much of a solicited effort to obtain that precious source of fresh extra food, which a vegetable garden is. And regarding the maneuvers, the constant training, you understand that much of the French strength there was connected with that collective training, being really astonishing. And in this, France actually owed much, just for example, Napoleon's artillery education. Think about the Gribeval reforms. Made a video about the Gribeval's artillery innovations and more. But generally speaking, it's the French military culture, one of the royal army of the continentally hegemonic power that France had been for more than a century, and generally speaking, at different times in European history, that made that great emphasis placed on discipline, on order. That specific terrestrial military culture that made the grognard the world conqueror at that point. And that is also what is that, just like the Royal Navy could not be qualitatively beaten by any other fleet in the world. The French army could not actually be qualitatively beaten by any other army in the world. So this was the real deal between these historical neighbors that still reflects, as we were saying before, still today, given the levels of development, etc., the stage of advancement that both the UK and France still embody. Not surprisingly, they are the only European nuclear powers for a reason. Now, naturally, that was not determined yet at the time, but still had deep roots even in their political and strategic culture in general. Now, in the meantime, and as to prove the civilizational aspect, the first consul was not idle either, right? He had to strengthen a state capable of supporting such a fort, right? And strengthening his own power and that degree of centralization were basically one thing. The new century had opened with great reforms in France. After the agrarian one, the financial and fiscal reform, then that of education, and finally Napoleon founded, of course, the greatest monument to his own figure as an innovator with the promulgation of the first great code, the civil code, the Code Napoleon. And this is, effectively, in the history of law, the moment in which the state becomes the only source of law. In other words, what here was disrupted with the Ancien Regime and alleged absolutism was actually the achievement of the absolute state. That is to say, a state that has a jurisdiction on everyone and everything on its own territory. And this really is the base of the contemporary state, fundamentally, as especially, in fact, in the civil law, because this followed essentially the Roman tradition in France and in other countries, is, in fact, not just basically the main juridical culture in the world, but also one that contributed by osmosis, let's say, to compact power also in the countries of common law that, as we were saying before, still reached similar conclusions, in spite the theory is really different, but in having that practical power that is needed to cope, again, with a state that is not just asking for the, say, procedurally speaking, to local communities, green light, right? That is a bigger problem that no power in the world can surpass, because no power in the world, from the most liberal democracies to the most vicious totalitarianisms, can do anything without the decisive moral support of the people. Right? It's always about the people and exclusively about the people. Every single damn thing that any government does ever, at all times. And there is no way of escaping that, because if you don't act, you're responsible for what will happen too. Right? So you will always pay for it, in a way or another. Now, with equal commitment, Napoleon ruthlessly fought against his main political opponents. After recognizing the police to ensure their widespread presence on the territory, right? These are essentially the same. Think about the gendarmerie and all the other these countries that followed, essentially, from the French one. Think about the Italian carabinieri, which is not police. It's not paramilitary police. It's literally demilitary. And this is something, in fact, that also differentiates consistently common and civil law countries regarding, again, this is the point I was making. It's the same if you look at these countries, in fact, military police, and at common law country paramilitary police. I mean, technically, they're exactly the same thing, right? Just legally, they're not, right? And that's again the cultural divide, but still the practical, share that we still have. Now, after this, Napoleon embarked on an aggressive campaign against internal opponents and refugees, by the way, which culminated famously or infamously enough in the kidnapping in a foreign land, by the way, and the execution on March the 21st, 1804, of the Duke of Enghien, Henri de Bourbon-Condé. The crime, which was seen as, completely senseless, at least, the Duke was killed without any convincing proof. Not that he wasn't, Napoleon's opponent, but still taking him out was seen, right, as relatively unnecessary, and also kind of considering that the broader antipathy that existed from many other people in Europe towards Napoleon, in fact, alienated from Napoleon himself the sympathy, in fact, already very low, of the crowned heads of Europe, especially because the Bourbon-Condé are essentially, we're basically part of the same French royalty, right? So this was a way to show from Napoleon in which, contempt he kept the royal authority and as a discontinuity with the past. And so this event also had a major moral, consequence, as the European royalties immediately began this complex network of negotiations that was to lead to the establishment of the Third Coalition. In those same days, William Pitt the Younger was recalled to the post of Prime Minister of Britain. This was a strong signal of the British determination to carry out the battle for world domination. Pitt, in fact, notoriously was perhaps the most bitter enemy that France could find among the courts of Europe. He had already been in government a few years earlier, distinguishing himself by the obstinacy with which he had woven diplomatic plots against revolutionary France, that, as we've seen, were reciprocated by equal enmity of on the French side. In fact, the stakes were that high, and both contenders understood it better and more deeply than those minds less accustomed to high strategic reasoning that governed the other European powers. And that's where, at the beginning of the video, we were hinting at by realizing that there is always an inertia, laziness, an ignorance, an incapacity, right, that derives from not getting into the fray, by isolating, by pretending that if you leave a vacuum of power, this will not be immediately filled by those who want to destroy you fundamentally. So great minds in the government, in the military of those times, understood this much better, like today, than most people, sometimes even the same governments. Britain was not fighting for the restoration of the balance of power of pre-revolutionary Europe. As a matter of fact, they were interested in that, but still instrumentally to their own goals. The continental rulers at best hoped that Britain could be doing this for their cause, but they were wrong, right? Britain wanted to assert a broader power, the first truly global one. And we know how rapidly and successfully Britain had emerged at that point in history, especially after the end of the 7 Years' War. Doesn't matter how painful the American debacle had been, but it was truly their a country, after all, historically a little country, right, in the northwestern fringe of Europe, that had managed to secure this enormous, to say the least, power, and thanks to its own, in fact, quality at that point, to its own enterprising character, through a sense of themselves and their primacy, right? And the fact that, this is how empires are built, right? If you are confident in yourself and you think that your system is the right one, you have means to prove it, well, you will have to fight for it. And so you have to be prepared also to be a real military power, one that works pretty well. And that's where the Royal Navy, is the mean for an island to rule the world, naturally was hypertrophically and highly successfully developed. But of course, also the world doesn't just stop there. There were, again, 200,000 men ready to land in Britain, right? And as you know, that stretch of sea in between is not really that long. You see, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor in the 16th century, could say that the sun never set on his empire, famously enough as a motto. But in fact, it was an uncontrollable empire, fragmented and devoid of connections, a sum of dynastic possessions of countries and peoples that had barely anything to do with each other. On the contrary, the British Empire that was emerging, and which found only revolutionary France as an obstacle, practically, because no other power in Europe was provided with the means of effectively countering Britain on a global scale. In fact, would have had the British Navy, absolute master of the seas, and its main strategic weapon to protect it and preserve its power. This is the point of the British, right? That they could make their army with, first-class Western standards intervene in every corner of the globe unchallenged, right? Because the strategic and logistical capacities of the Royal Navy were unmatched by anyone, right? Even the presence of coalesced enemies. In fact, that's what happened also, was reconfirmed, albeit with Nelson's personal sacrifice at Trafalgar against the French and the Spanish. And this is a big deal, right? Still largely today, just think about the United States is fundamentally the only power in the world that is capable of waging war practically everywhere. Marine Corps being deputed exactly to that operational function. So times are different, but still the logistical needs of an empire on the seas are pretty similar, right? After Victorian times, naval strategy is dramatically different. So in the Napoleonic ones, still there is much. In fact, it doesn't work so swiftly on as on land as Napoleon was to find out the hard way, because he didn't really, one of the greatest military minds of all times, but didn't quite have much of a maritime strategic culture. And again, he was the product of French military culture. You gotta understand that. But still, we're talking of a naval power that could prevent, in fact, any other power to contend that global projection, and thus, allowing the British to secure their positions in the world step by step. Now, the first adhesions to the Third Coalition came, in fact, from Great Britain, Russia, Sweden, and the Kingdom of Naples. It took over a year for the coalition to be completed by the formal accession of Austria on August the 9th, 1805, or 10 days after the coalition had declared war on France on July the 31st, in fact, 1805. And the unhappy experiences of the two past coalitions had convinced, in fact, the Habsburgs that they could not place the utmost trust in their allies, right? The Third Coalition lacked also the accession of Prussia, and for a very specific reason, that is the dispute that this nation had with Great Britain over the possession of Hanover, which weighed heavily in this decision. However, the ambitious court of Berlin was confident that it would take advantage of the favorable opportunities that would surely arise to sell at a high price an alliance that at this particular moment had the same political weight as that of Naples or Sweden. I remind you that 1 year after Prussia was destroyed by the French, right, that march on Berlin. So just for the record of, don't kid with superpowers, right? And if you want to win wars, don't be individualistic about it. Just join a solid alliance with confidence, with conviction, with clear ideas, clear objectives, right? And give that damn full force to get the thing over with as soon as possible in the first place. Now, of course, the aforementioned wait-and-see and opportunistic attitude of Prussia hardly pleased the members of the coalition, who would have gladly tied a chain with a sturdy extra ring around Napoleon's neck that really wanted to see cut. In fact, the ruling dynasties of Europe did not lack at all good reasons for wanting the fall of Napoleon. The Habsburgs, the Austrians in particular, were those who had suffered the heaviest damage in the previous years, right? The French expansion in Germany and in Italy was historically, from centuries, what essentially the Habsburgic monarchy had tried to prevent. Always, even by, allying themselves with France against Prussia, they were still contending fundamentally the Bourbon, that important asset. The same goes for Italy, broadly speaking. Since the War of Spanish Succession, as you know, Spain was a Bourbon possession, and Austria lacked fundamentally also a colonial capacity. It was a fully continental power. Yes, there had been from the Habsburgic Netherlands back in the day some colonial adventures since the time of Maria Theresa, etc. But as you know, first of all, at this point, those had jumped exactly with the rise of revolutionary France in 1797. But that was the least, after all. In 1805, especially, the Habsburgs could lament the loss of rich territories, such as, in fact, Lombardy, first of all, then Belgium. This had been partially compensated by the purchase of the Veneto that the French had agreed to, and that's how the Republic of Venice had disappeared historically in the process, by the way. And in the process, the Habsburgs were forced by the French to recognize the Cisalpine Republic in northern Italy, also the Republic of Genoa, and these were formerly Holy Roman Imperial territories, right? Secularization was on its way, like there was the heaviest thing. The Holy Roman Empire ended because of Napoleon. And there were naturally the claims of the French on the same left bank on the Rhine in Germany, that at least, however, were not Jacobinized, let's say, how has the Italian and other territories. And having become emperor in 1792, Francis II in 1805 was fairly young. I mean, he was 38 years old, but was a man who had aged fast, albeit gradually, among all these defeats, disasters, and ruins, right? And unfortunately for him, the worst was yet to come. If you know how things went, the king emperor, say, was in the very uncomfortable condition of someone who, after having lost a fortune at the table against a skilled professional player, cannot help but return to try to make up for it. And there was objectively not much, in fact, that Austria could do, given that it was just on the outskirts of the French Empire, was factually the main continental opponent, unless we consider Russia, that we will see now, but that was also kind of a more distant, and the presence of the same Austria, of the same Britain, that, as we will see now, didn't like at all the Russian ambition in the Baltic, nor in the Balkans, and there was the Ottoman Empire there that was basically just a European fiction that halted the Russian giant. But the Austrians, after 2 lost wars and 2 unfavorable peace treaties, were definitely traumatized, but they couldn't give up that broader political and strategic role they had in Central Europe. A third blow, however, was coming that would prove even harder, in fact, than the others to absorb. Now, speaking of Russia, the Tsar of all Russia, Alexander I, was 27 years old, and he was at the head of the most populous nation in Europe since 1801, an estimated 40 million inhabitants in Russia against the 25 million of France. When, after a palace conspiracy, he had succeeded his father, Paul I, a man with a very important place in the crowded gallery of the mad Tsars. And Russian situation was definitely not easy either, right? But let's say it was this giant that had coalesced essentially in the last century as a new power, especially if we consider its westernization since the time of Peter the Great, and that had in fact this enormous influence. They all, as you know, they even had territories in North America. They had this enormous lands, populated sparsely mostly, but so extensively that it could gather that huge amount of people in the meat grinder, and manpower, given the means of the time. Technology is much less expensive, was much less expensive at the time than today for making war. So that was a great supply of men, and during the Napoleonic Wars, as you know, that would play a lot in spite of the critical backwardness of the country. And even to Alexander, telling the truth, albeit temperamentally very different from his father, there would be occasion to show little common sense, telling the truth. And to begin with, it was not to be taken for granted, as we were saying before, that France was actually Russia's main European enemy. And this had been a substantial dispute with the allies of the Third Coalition, because with the United Kingdom denying an expansionism to Northern Europe, among the forests of the Scandinavian peninsula on wood the British fleet depended, especially after they had lost Boston, and which it did not recognize the Order of the Knights of St. John, whose Grand Master, by sheer coincidence, was the Tsar himself, the sovereignty on the island of Malta that had been, as you know, recently captured by the British. Austria would have obstructed definitely the Russian claims on the Balkan Peninsula, over which the Habsburgs had, the preferential intervention, and they did definitely not want to share with anyone the pleasure of giving the coup de grace to the sick of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and that's paradoxically the reason why the Ottoman Empire lasted so long, until the end of World War I, because fundamentally nobody was really interested in going at war for the chunks of the Ottoman Empire that would have engulfed, in fact, as it did in part with the same World War I, the entire world. But that just was one of the factors. In any case, the Ottoman Empire was growing ever more dependent on all these various powers. There was also, from the Austrian side, the age-old Polish questions. As you know, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been partitioned in the end of the 18th century. This was fresh history, telling the truth by some degree. And in the division of the Commonwealth, Russia and Prussia notoriously had the lion's share, had taken the most productive territories. Warsaw was Russian. The Prussia had annexed many lands in the north and the Baltic. Austria was left only with the crumbs. Right, it had the poorest areas of the former Commonwealth. I made a video about Habsburgic Galicia, by the way. That was, generally speaking, an interesting hub eventually for development of the modern Ukrainian national identity over time, in function of recovering also the lands in the rest in Ukraine properly that had fallen under Russia as well. But these territories were some of the least productive and also the more poorly administered of all. Like the Habsburgs objectively didn't have many reason to invest there as opposed to to other areas, especially considering the problems that now the empire had, especially in the west. But the Habsburgs were always eager. They were always looking for every pretext to question their northeastern borders as well in an anti-Russian function. And objectively, Russia was ideally to push, as it always tried to do, towards Central Europe, right, to seize this important amount of land that eventually in the 19th century would become also the region around which the theory of geopolitics, at least the one that did not degenerate into an ethno-populistic delusion, like most people that speak of geopolitics today basically only do, without knowing practically nothing, nor about history, of course, but nor politics, nor strategy, nor understanding, of course, that geopolitics does not exist. And they had the manpower for pushing there. So Austria was really shattered by these events. It was ruling, as you know, on more foreign people than Germans themselves. So just like Prussia, they were states that had formed more outside the empire than within it historically. So it was very complicated to maintain a balance in all this. And so Russia was really a problematic character of this. There was also an anti-French sentiment at the court of St. Petersburg. However, this was strong, in fact, and its most authoritative representative was the Tsar's mother, by the way. Considered that Alexander had a great admiration for the deeds that a man like Napoleon spontaneously provoked. Right, these are old things, old family issues, right? The young Joseph II, with great disdain of his mother, Maria Theresia, while the Prussians were crushing the Austrians in Silesia, and etc., had a little bust of the same Frederick II that is somewhat venerated, and I think she prevented her son to keep this cult going on. Consider, again, we're talking about ancien regime mentality. So what I always discuss about the ideology of universal tradition of the empire, of leaders, of commanders, this was legitimately the universal moral standard that still today basically we have abandoned because we are devoid of morals, but that is the point, right? The best power, the greatest civilization, the greatest culture has all the right of ruling the world, and for everybody's benefit, right? So that's what it's even more pathetic, of course, when people don't recognize that they're nor an empire, nor a culture, nor a civilization, and try to act as one, engulfing the whole freaking world for no reason. And yes, I'm talking about Russia today, just in case for those who think that, America is evil. No, if you think that America is evil and others are not, I mean, you literally come from a culturally underdeveloped background. It doesn't matter whether you were born in a first world country, you're just, culturally underdeveloped. It's a problem of your family, of your lack of education, of your poverty, both moral and material. And it's a huge problem. And you are actually historically looking at the end of the people in all ages, fortunately, the one that will get under pretty soon to work for those who make things work. So just be ensured and at least try to remain silent in the process. So Alexander I was a bit like the same thing, right? He had first admired Napoleon because he thought he was, the greatest ruler ever. Then he felt invested in the sacred mission of extirpating from the world the disruptor of the natural order of things. Or this was in many ways, the same. I mean, of course, I'm not trying to psychoanalyze Alexander I, but people change, right? And you age, and especially if you are the Tsar of all Russia, you will naturally think that the divine great scheme in which a representative of a dynasty chosen by God ought to be ruling autarchically on the mass of his subjects with the benevolence, but also on occasion a steady wrist that read iron fist that guides his own children, was naturally the traditional natural elected role that such a ruler must have. So at the time, of course, Russia was an incredibly different thing from today, and again, already for the time standards, was nothing to be flattered for, but it was at least a big power with a great potential, and especially during Napoleonic Wars, you can argue the top of Russian military quality was reached compared to the rest of the world, at least, in this very kind of idea of bulky, sturdy infantry loads, and also a consistent, artillery pounding power that combined, in a very brutal but effective way, also posed some, created some headaches to the same Napoleon. Now, there is no need to add that Alexander considered himself the purest interpreter of this order of things in a quite Russian sense, so in an imperialistic, universalistic one as well. Well, Western Europe was already, something else. As we've seen before, France, yes, 45 million inhabitants, but there was also the rest of Europe there that was already also heading towards a much different direction with industrialization, and as you know, Eastern Europe would fall dramatically behind. It does also because of the same nature of the Tsarist Empire. In many ways, as the reforms had already failed under Catherine the Great, that did what she could impressively enough as a ruler in that nightmare that Russia was. But in this sense, waging war on France from Alexander's side was not a question of stubbornness, right? There were very solid political reasons as well that were expressed in favor of Russian participation in anti-French coalitions. In the first place, because the occasions of discord with Austria and the United Kingdom, as we have already exemplified them, were also a privileged place for the Tsar to meet and exchange with the same countries. And secondly, because the role of great power to which Russia aspired could only pass from participation in anti-Napoleonic coalitions. What would you do there? Isolate? Especially with countries, again, that in part depend in that sense on your help and that you can depend on. In fact, Great Britain and Austria needed Russian human potential, manpower, and English gold was also able to pay for arms for make an army of it, right? So the connection between these countries were kind of unfolding naturally in that situation. The bill would be presented upon victory, right? So that was not the moment to draw conclusions, but if anything, to increase the effort to facilitate victory. Now, for the time being, Russia was showing enthusiasm to join the coalition, although it had to contribute to the Allied armies with already considerable figure of 90,000 men. It mobilized as much as 280,000, right? An impressive show of strength directed against Napoleon, but not only against him. Now, there will be a lot here we will discuss in the series. Remember, this is just an introduction So it has nothing to do with the details of the campaign, the strategy, the battles, nothing, right? This is just to clarify a little bit what the background was. But consider, I mean, these allies didn't even have the same calendar, right? The Russians used still the Julian one. The others had the Gregorian one, so they couldn't even coordinate themselves with each other at some point with the marches, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of men across Central and Eastern Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. I mean, it's really a very complicated thing, and this will partly play a role, not just in the war of the Third Coalition, but generally speaking during the Napoleonic eras. And as you know, the French were also the best at that. And you know, the campaign of Austerlitz, especially the march, the glorious march of the French through the Black Forest in Germany, is one of, it's arguably the most famous military march, but it's one of the most famous ones in history. Especially in those conditions, like literally sleeping while walking in order to save time. And well, it's very instructive in that regard. But a little bit, Russia was showing off, saying, okay, we'll put almost 200,000 men on the table. Any reference to common events also coincidentally matches, but you know, in comparison, the Russians knew how to mobilize troops much better at the time than they do today. And you know, you do not come out as a normal country after 70 years of communism, and it does not stop in 30 years, right? It takes at least 1 century to become something normal. And you know, hardly after also that Tsarist and Mongol background, there can't be anything called normal by Western standards, but that's another problem. Now, since December the 2nd, 1804, this is also very relevant regarding the concept of universal tradition and Napoleon's attitude. Bonaparte was emperor, right? He had crowned himself, famously enough. There were very complicated, say, relations, as you know, between France and the papacy. The French would also properly march on Rome and kidnap the Pope. The whole crowning was also a religious show-off, except Emperor took the crown from the papal hands and put it on his own head and crowned his wife as empress. I mean, definitely there was something wrong there in terms of traditionalism, but it's still quite relevant for what naturally France as a Catholic country and the role it always had in that scenario had to require in order to be ruled. The Gallican Church still had its own quite personal ideas about its role in Christendom. In any case, Napoleon, contrarily to what you may think, did not want this crown out of ambition, because as a lifetime consul in France, he had already been exercising an imperial power, right? The point here was to let the world know the time horizon, the mindset frame he saw for his own regime and for the French. Like this was a precise message, but transmissible only with the use of force, of course, which obviously had to have as its primary objective the main weaver of anti-French plots. This was Great Britain. Britain was not, as you know, very sensitive to much of what was happening continentally in a, from her own national perspective and spirit. But it's obvious that somebody that crowns himself emperor is, controlling great part of Europe and is amassing hundreds of thousands of men to invade your own country. And there is in theory still an emperor actually in Europe that is instead in deep trouble and sees already its situation falling apart with literally an exploding France that is overwhelming everything. Well, it is quite meaningful worldwide. And in front of Europeans that naturally were quite traditional, just per se, right? There were this Jacobin revolutionary movements that had met with sympathies also in an independentistic sense in other countries, but generally speaking, these symbols were deeply felt by Europeans. Europeans at the beginning of the 19th century definitely knew what an empire really was, a European Christian universal empire. Now, by early August 1805, the preparations for Napoleon's invasion had finally come to a good point. It would have been enough for the French fleet led by Admiral Villeneuve to have reached the Channel in time to protect the army's transfer voyage, and England would have been overrun. Right? Consider this perspective, not just France was a giant demographically and agriculturally compared to Britain, that relied fundamentally on this naval shield, as it had already done historically, but also that the United Kingdom and an empire, any power, as we were saying before, can be unhinged. Right? If you take out, in that case, it's really the problem at the root. Right? You occupy the country, so even what is floating at sea doesn't matter by a certain degree, and you will have basically no funds, no connections, no everything would collapse. Right, and the French naval strategy is much more complex than what I'm telling you now, and so the British response, of course. Let's just say that Napoleon was anxiously awaiting news from Villeneuve, but he found it difficult. The Emperor found it difficult to understand, as we were saying before, that fleets did not move on the seas with mathematical precision. As the mathematical precision of his land forces, and he had to take note of the changed situation by designing an alternative plan, even if the French sails had arrived punctually for the date scheduled for the invasion of Great Britain. By now, his army seemed more necessary elsewhere in continental Europe. So the situation, of course, triggered by the Third Coalition, had radically changed the entire balance. Right, so Napoleon could not employ all that manpower to invade England while Russia, Austria, Naples, and other powers were mobilizing against him. On August the 13th, Napoleon dictated to Daru, the trusted general steward, say, of the imperial house, a series of very secret provisions that laid the foundations of the plan of operations with which he intended to face the continental enemies directed against his borders. This was a very quick response, a change of objective of lightning fast readiness. And as we have seen in the psychological chapter of von Clausewitz, von Kriege, was the product of a superior strategic vision, right? The decision of a true leader, undoubtedly. You take enormous moral force just even to conceive, to order, to plan such a thing, right? Napoleon had that kind of broader spirit, right? That was galvanizing the same country, the same people that were willing to fight for him, right? Because this man knew his deal, and was perfectly in control of the situation. And the 1805 campaign is, in fact, the utmost proof of this, right? In 1805, Napoleon's projects were assisted by a formidable war machine that he had put up. And it was unmatched in Europe, and also the best Napoleon will ever have at his disposal, by the way. This was led, by the way, by an elite of a brilliant and ambitious youth, the jeunesse dorée, which, extends a bit to the entire generation of young French that went to fight and die for l'Empereur, whom, in fact, the Emperor had recently appointed as, by the way, marshals of the empire, to strengthen their royalty and to create a new aristocracy, a new elite, a new ruling class for the French Empire. These commanders who emerged from literally nothing or almost nothing in the wars of the Revolution deserved recognition on the battlefield. There were pros and cons at some levels, but it worked pretty well for the new army, much more meritocratic sense. This sometimes made them greedy for gain, often reckless also, but never cowardly, and this is very important indeed when fighting a war, and especially from as leadership. And the men under their command are equally hardened and perfectly trained to be instruments of the new type of war that Napoleon introduced to Europe. Right, the campaign of 1805 was essentially a big test of the entire system. Right, these countries were essentially to wipe each other out significantly. France could lose as well, and so you can never predict how things were really going to end. And this is why you need to show your best if you really want to succeed in the first place. So the French army, as we will see in the series, will cross half of the European continent fighting. We will suffer the inclemency of the weather, will suffer from hunger, moved essentially only by faith in victory. This is any great empire who ever achieved that degree of magnitudinal civilizational accomplishment had faith in victory. Like, nobody could really make them think otherwise, right? Not even death. And Napoleon also was definitely venerated in this sense to satisfy his personal ambition, leading this man to die, but also to victory. And one could ask, perhaps a bit too, arrogantly, to pretend to know what this man really felt at the time. We are extensively documented for this times, differently from the ones that we more generally approach. But there is something big about the military spirit regarding gamble, right? The most militarily capable, right, and the most gambling you are in many ways, and this was something that the Romans already had noticed. They expressed in their very close relation with Fortuna. I even made a video about Caesar's religion in this sense. But you may wanna think that these men went to fight and die for Napoleon, perhaps even just from the curiosity to see where Napoleon could arrive, and from the awareness of being part of his great history, to be part of history themselves. And this is a crucially imperial, universal, traditional concept, right? Your leader is the one who must be flawless to be followed, and must give that confidence and that power. And then, there is hardly frequently anyone like this. Napoleon surely in his own times embodied, perhaps best than any other, that figure. And of course one would think immediately at Hegel's encounter with Napoleon at Vienna while the emperor was passing by on horseback in the streets of the German philosopher's city, and that's where Hegel was struck by the intuition that made also was idealistic philosophy, that the great spirit of history was passing through Napoleon. And most people know this concept just through Hegelian philosophy, but it was actually the universal traditional idea. It was believed practically by anyone traditionally that, again, God was with the victorious commander. There was an imperium, a force that descended from heaven that conferred victory to uncommon mortals that could aspire to divinity and to eternal glory, right? And so hopefully this playlist will this series, excuse me, will exemplify. Of course, there will be a playlist for it, but will exemplify what it means, the cost, the price, the ability, the competence that is needed to wage a war in the first place, and what it means to just put everything at stake, even your own life, if you really want to accomplish something what others thought could not be accomplished. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.